And Barry, the gang's all here.
Hey, welcome, Barry. How are you? Great.
Hey, everyone.
So, without any further ado, let me call this meeting to order. Meeting of the Planning Board for January 24, 2022, for the purpose and discussion of warrant articles relating to the short-term rental and workforce housing. First order of business, I'd like to say that we are conducting this meeting via Zoom, webinar, and remote participation pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12, 2020 order regarding open meeting law. I'd like to identify the members of the board staff. So when I call your name, please state aye or yes. John Trudell, myself, chairperson. Vice Chair Dave Iverson.
Here.
Nat Lowell.
Here.
Fritz McClure.
Here.
Barry Rector.
Here.
I see alternate Campbell Sutton.
Here.
Any other alternate? Dave or Stephen present? No. I'll go to, I see Town Council John Giorgio.
Present.
Staff Leslie Snell.
Here.
Andrew Vorse.
Here.
Meg Trudell.
Here.
And Catherine Nancero.
Here.
Great. So with that out of the way, I'd like to see if I can get an approval for the agenda. Motion to approve.
So moved.
So moved.
First made by Dave, I think had it, seconded by Nat. Roll call.
I'll
Dave.
second it. Yep.
Aye.
Nat,
Aye.
Fritz,
Aye.
and Barry.
Aye.
Okay. So our first order of business of short-term rentals discussion. This is intended not as a public meeting open to the public. We're going to be talking about this as a board. And I also would like to recuse myself. As stated, I contacted the state and I was advised, because I am a professional licensed real estate person, that any discussion has the potential for a future conflict. So I'm going to remove myself of that. And because of that, I would ask that Vice Chairperson Dave Iverson step up to run the meeting in my absence. When discussion is ended, I will be logging off. When discussion has ended, I would ask that Meg contact me. I'm going to be logging out and I will log back in to pick up discussions about the workforce housing. So with that, I'm going to log off and I hand that over to Dave Iverson.
Thanks, John.
Good luck.
Thank you. So just to make things clear, and just a reminder that this is a board discussion only. We won't be having any public comment at this time, but this will be before the board again, I think next week, where it will be open for public discussion. Also, we're only discussing this article today and the workforce housing article. And again, that will not be public discussion until next week as well. So is there anything else? Does a staff member want to tee this up, or where are we at?
Sure, I can start if you want, Chairman Iverson. As the board may remember, we have had we first generated a list some time ago about warrant articles we would be considering. And the last time we discussed short-term rentals was in early December. At that time, we reviewed 6 concepts that we were going to advance regarding short-term rentals. And the article that you have before you is a proposal, a zoning bylaw amendment. And what we're discussing is basically to include that article as written, to make any changes to that article, or to not include that article for some reason in the upcoming warrant. And the final say on this matter goes with the select board, but I think, as you know, we've been working with them and with town administration, with our town council who's joined us today for amendments to town regulations that address short-term rental. We did include in your packet a general bylaw change, which you will not be hearing, but the finance committee will be hearing that. That article has been included, voted to be included by the select board, and that will appear in the upcoming warrant. And in related to that too is the separate fund, reserve fund, where basically registration fees and other fees related to that bylaw would be included. So our final proposal on the zoning article has been submitted. We included a chart to show you where those particular concepts landed. Council is here to ask any questions. And John, is there anything you wanted to add on this at all?
Not yet, Andrew. You're doing great.
Okay, all right. We wanted to make sure through the process that what was being proposed on the general bylaw side was consistent. And again, town council assisted us with that to make sure our definitions align with state law. Basically, what you have is what we've been discussing. So we're happy to answer questions from the board about it. Leslie, did you have anything to add? I'm sorry. Maybe not. Okay.
Sorry, my button was stuck. I couldn't get the camera turned back on. No, I think that's good for now.
Actually, if I may, Mr. Chairman, maybe just a brief explanation of how the definitions were developed for short-term rental, because as you know, under the state rooms tax statute, that statute was amended to provide that short-term rentals would be covered for purposes of collection of the rooms tax. And Andrew and Leslie and I felt it was important to hew to that definition as close as possible. The challenge was, however, that your zoning bylaw has its own set of definitions. And in order to be internally consistent with the zoning bylaw, we developed the definition of short-term rentals that you see before you. The key thing to keep in mind here is that under the state statute, hotels, motels, bed and breakfasts and lodging houses are excluded from the definition of short-term rental. Now, in your zoning bylaw, the way you deal with that is through the definition, the definition of transient residential facilities. Those are if you will, an exception to the definition of dwelling unit or residence. So the way we've done this is this definition in the zoning bylaw now matches closely with the state law. And it's important to keep in mind that there are essentially two exemptions in state law for the rooms tax on short-term rentals. One is if someone rents their unit for less than a total of 14 days a year, they are exempt from the tax. And they will also be exempt from this provision in your zoning bylaw. We've added that in. And then any kind of a rental that exceeds 31 days, consecutive days, that's also exempted under state law. So if somebody wants to rent their house for the year, for example, for a full year's lease, then that's not considered a short-term rental. And the concept then was to provide that short-term rentals in dwelling units that are not transient residential facilities will be allowed as of right. Unless the planning board, that being you guys, issue a special permit, for example, for workforce housing, you can, as a condition of that special permit, prohibit short-term rentals. Now, one of the questions that came up is, how does the town regulate the activity to ensure that short-term rentals do not become a nuisance condition? And that's dealt with in the general bylaw, even though that's not in front of you. The general bylaw proposal basically authorizes the Board of Health to enact regulations to address nuisance conditions. So overburdening of parking, excessive noise, and the like will be regulated through the general bylaw and the regulations that will be adopted thereunder. And it's important to emphasize that under the general bylaw, the town has the ability to enact enhanced penalties, and which are now included in that general bylaw provision. There's a concept known as a civil penalty. And the general bylaw says that if you violate a regulation or the bylaw, you're subject to a civil penalty of up to $5,000 per violation. And while that would not be the normal enforcement mechanism, we also have non-criminal disposition and the like, so there would be the ability to issue tickets. But if you had a persistent violator, the general bylaw has that enhanced penalty and the ability of the Board of Health to revoke or suspend a certificate of registration, meaning that that individual could no longer operate the short-term rental for whatever period of time the Board of Health determined was appropriate. So I think you have to look at not only your zoning bylaw, but also the general bylaw and the regulations that will follow, assuming town meeting approves the general bylaw. So that's sort of the overview of the way this is intended to work.
John, so the health department will be the enforcement entity here completely.
Well, not exclusively. Not exclusively. So under zoning, the building commissioner still has the authority to enforce the zoning bylaw.
Okay.
So it's really multiple levels of enforcement, and the ability of the building inspector, as I said, to enforce the zoning aspect of this will continue unabated.
And when you say that, that would be like in an apartment that we've said no.
Yeah.
That's the kind of situation, but noise, parking, that's a health department.
Yes.
Okay.
Now, and I suppose that would be unless the planning board chose in a special permit to allow a short-term rental, but subject to other conditions. So if there are conditions imposed in a planning board special permit, those would be enforceable as a matter of zoning as well.
Mr. Chairman, can I just ask town council a question? Well, it's more of that's an observation. So it seems to me, just listening to everything you just said, John, the parts that we already have, like, for example, if you have a noisy neighbor that happens to have parties every weekend, but they live there and they just are a nuisance, that the issue with a short-term rental doing the same thing fits under the same course of action. Whereas the separate, it seems that we're trying to use our existing regulations for the things that make sense regarding neighborly issues versus adopting, separate the separate stuff involving, what makes a short-term rental, the registration, all that stuff. Is that pretty much what you're saying? That's what it sounds like. And I think that makes a lot of
Well,
sense.
Essentially, yes, that's correct. But
Okay.
the regulations that will be enacted by the Board of Health are only going to apply to short-term rentals. If you just have a plain noisy neighbor who is creating the nuisance condition on their property, and it's not a short-term rental situation, then that could potentially be enforced through your noise bylaw. And of course, it could be enforced potentially civilly if a nuisance condition is being created. The regulations here will only apply to short-term rentals, however. Because there really is no, if you will, ability to, other than through your noise bylaw, to enforce nuisance conditions on property.
Are you good, Nat?
Okay.
You
Got
good?
it.
All right, Campbell.
Hi, thank you. This is just a general question based on the definition of short-term rentals and where they're allowed. As you know, a primary, secondary, tertiary, duplex, et cetera, et cetera. So one question I have about this is, I thought the board had discussed making it so a particular property couldn't do short-term rentals. I'm not sure how to describe this, but where the primary house was rented separately from the secondary, separately from the tertiary. In other words, where on one property you might have 3 eligible dwelling units for rent, but that they're all rented to different entities. So I thought we had maybe discussed about trying to ensure that per property, there was only one rental person or entity doing the renting. And I'm not sure if that fits in here or not.
If I may, Campbell, if I may, Leslie and Andrew, prepared a very helpful chart.
Right.
And you're talking about item number 1, I believe. And it was determined, and I don't mean to speak for Andrew and Leslie, but they can certainly fill in on this, but that additional data is needed to really determine how many structures on each lot are being used as short-term rentals. And so that might be something. It's not covered in this particular bylaw, but it could be the subject of a future amendment. And I think it's important to look at this as a first start. And there may be other regulations that need to be enacted through zoning to address specific issues, because the whole point, one of the points of the certificate of registration under the general bylaw is for the town to get a better handle on what properties are being rented, what's the intensity of use in particular neighborhoods, and that kind of thing.
Okay, great. I thought it might be under regulation, but I saw it on this in a couple of places where it was broadly allowed. So I just wanted to double check on that. So I appreciate your response, John. Thank you.
You're welcome.
All set, Campbell?
I am.
Chair?
Thank
All right. Andrew?
I just wanted to add, and thank you, John, for explaining that. I think it's also important for the board to understand the enforcement procedure is much more effective through the general regulation. So again, a regulation like that enforced through the Board of Health is going to be much more effective, and I guess it will produce the results faster than our zoning enforcement procedure, which is very cumbersome.
Right.
We are knee deep with many enforcement requests through town council, and they are long and tedious, and it takes years to get really compliance. So anyway.
And if I may, Mr. Chair, just to build on what Andrew was saying, one of the things the legislature did with the short-term rental law was provide very enhanced authority for boards to regulate this use, yes, through a bylaw or regulation. That has not been tested yet, but I think and correct me if I'm wrong, Andrew, you're suggesting that once we receive the data and we look at this, it is possible that that could be regulated through the Board of Health regulations rather than zoning.
Yes.
And that's an open question, but I think the structure is there to come to that conclusion, if you will.
All righty. Fritz. Fritz.
Yes, sorry, I just had to get unmuted. Let me, just on the issues that we've been talking about, if you look at the chart, and you have regulation in X's and 3 boxes. So when you're talking about regulation, you mean regulation by the Board of Health, correct?
Yes.
That's not a zoning regulation or anything. Okay.
No.
So now, I've got 2 questions when it comes to that. What is the, where do you draw the line between what is a zoning matter and what is a matter that can be regulated by a general bylaw? In other words, to the extent, and maybe you started to touch on this just a minute ago, I think, but to what extent would conditions on short-term rentals be imposed by a Board of Health as opposed to having to be imposed by a zoning bylaw?
So that's really an excellent question. And let me answer it this way. As I indicated, the short-term rental law has very broad language in it in terms of the ability of the town to enact bylaws and regulations. It doesn't specify whether they have to be zoning or whether they can be done by general bylaw. And if you remember at last year's town meeting, we had the proposal to enact a general bylaw that that would regulate short-term rentals significantly. And we did prepare, for the benefit of the planning board, a very extensive opinion about that, and whether or not the kinds of regulations that were in that general bylaw would withstand a legal challenge under the series of cases that essentially says if you're regulating, and this is a very broad brush conclusion, but if you're regulating land use, it has to be the subject of zoning. So that is absolutely an open question at this point, and that's why I was hedging a little bit. I think it's going to depend on, once you have all your data, determining what problems exist and how the town wants to address those problems. And it may be that can be done through zoning. Maybe it can be done through regulation. We're just going to have to wait and see, because basically the jury is out on this in terms of case law. It's certainly not settled by any stretch of the imagination.
Okay, then one follow-up, if I may, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
To the extent that we then, so the approach, let me just start. This is very different than the approach that I saw in a draft bylaw that was given to the select board on January the 5th. So, and what it's moved in the direction of is sort of saying, we're going to allow it everywhere, and then we're going to study a few things. My question relates to this. To what extent, if you pass a bylaw that allows it as a matter of right everywhere except for workforce housing and apartment buildings, to what extent can you then restrict it at a future date? do you run into, I guess we're running into the concept of grandfathering or not grandfathering, where you're controlled by law as to what you can do. So it's like creating pre-existing use. Is it going to create all of these being a pre-existing use that would then have to be allowed to exist for a period of time?
Well, I'm sorry, there's no period of time. It's whatever the town decides in terms of zoning regulations. So we all know that if you have a previously existing legal non-conforming use, then you are, I mean, the term really is grandfathered. You're allowed to continue that use.
Okay, bad choice of example. Let me just put the example to you, and then I can just ask the board straight. So let's assume we do this, and at some point in the future, we study it and we say, gee, there should be some sort of a maximum number of days. In other words, what's in column 5? Let's decide sometime in the future, we decide really is a place we ought to go. So now you have and I own a building, or I own a house that's a short-term rental. We passed the first bylaw. I by right can have a short-term rental. Now you pass at a later date an additional bylaw or a change to the bylaw, which says I'm limited to a maximum number of days. Does that just take effect on the day you enact it?
Well, a zoning bylaw takes effect on the day that it's enacted, subject to approval by the Attorney General. But if you are prohibiting or restricting a use that was legal before the bylaw took effect, then it's a pre-existing non-conforming use and it may continue.
Forever?
Yeah, basically, unless you can't change that or substantially extend it.
Okay, so it would only apply to new short-term rentals.
It applies to any use that was in existence at the time the bylaw was enacted.
No, I'm sorry. The change, the restriction would only apply to future.
Yeah.
Okay. So aren't we really kidding ourselves if we say in any of these columns that we're going to pass the general, we're going to say it's by matter of right, but sometime in the future we might change it? Isn't that really?
Well,
we're kind of cooked once we pass.
Well,
bylaws.
I'm sorry, Fritz, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but that's where the general bylaw very well may come into place, because you could amend the general bylaw or the regulations thereunder, and that would not be subject to grandfathering, and it would be equally enforceable.
If it's not deemed to be a zoning bylaw.
That's correct.
Which you say is subject to question.
Well, it very much depends, Fritz, on the kind of regulation you're talking about.
But in the context of the example that I used, a restriction on the number of days.
Right.
Is that a zoning?
I think you can make
restriction, or is that a general bylaw restriction?
Well, let's assume it's enacted as a general bylaw restriction. And under 64G section 14, there's no distinction between general and zoning bylaws. The statute merely says that the town can enact bylaws regulating short-term rentals. I believe that statute also says with respect to the duration of the rental. So I think there's a strong argument that because the legislature did not specify that it has to be done by zoning, that it could be done by a general bylaw. But when I say the jury is out, again, these concepts have not been fully litigated, and there's no precedent out there for me to give you sort of an ironclad guarantee. But I think the way the statute is constructed, there's a very strong argument that the town could regulate the duration of use through a general bylaw or regulations adopted thereunder.
All right, but as a practical matter, given the number of short-term rentals that there are and the fact that some of those are corporate owned or owned by off-island businesses or off-island people with financial means. If we were to attempt to do that, it's quite likely that a lawsuit would follow claiming we don't have the right to do that.
Well, anybody with a couple of $100 can file a lawsuit, so you don't have to be a wealthy corporation to do that. And believe me, you have lots of people challenging your zoning bylaws and decisions of the planning board. Fritz, I would not let that dissuade you from addressing what I think is a carefully constructed approach to regulating short-term rentals through a three-pronged approach, and that's what we're doing here.
Now, what I'm getting at is that you're likely to be facing a lawsuit by somebody who has the financial, or a group that have the financial resources to continue that suit for a long period of time, very expensive to the town. And with what assurance of a favorable outcome to the town when you say, yes, you have a strong argument, or maybe the case law is undecided. So it's a question mark, I think you have to admit.
Well, I started off by saying that was unsettled. Yeah. But again, I think that, you know, I deal with providing legal advice to municipal clients.
Yeah.
And I think this has been set up by the legislature very nicely for the town to be able to argue that a general bylaw restricting the number of days a person could rent their property. I think that there's I think that would be a defensible bylaw. Can I guarantee? Yes, it would withstand a legal challenge. Well, I have never guaranteed that in my 36 years of practicing municipal law. All I can tell you is I think the way the statutes are constructed, I think there's certainly a good argument to that effect.
Okay. Thank you. That's all I have for the moment.
Can I ask?
Can I just for clarity, John, because I think Fritz had a lot of really good points, and I just want to make sure I understand. So if we pass this tomorrow, let's say.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Now, if we pass this tomorrow, our only way to pull back would be through general bylaw, because as soon as it's established in zoning, it's going to be grandfathered going forward. So the only control we'll have after that is through general bylaw.
Well, I hate to just give a blanket answer to that, Mr. Chairman. But again, if you create a by right use, and one of the questions, of course, that currently exists are short-term rentals allowed as of right now, right? And you have those decisions from the zoning board that have been appealed or maybe will be appealed. And I think it's important that you establish a zoning structure that fits the nature of the community.
No, it makes sense. I just want to understand.
Yeah. So yes, but
forward after this.
With that caveat, you would still have the ability, in my opinion, to regulate the length of the number of days somebody could do a short-term rental at their property. You could do that by general bylaw or by regulation.
Thank you. We go Nat.
Yeah, I just want to, I'm going to make you laugh, but I'm going to just ask a simple question. We just approved farming in every zoning district, correct, Leslie? Is that true?
Agriculture is allowed in all zoning districts, yes.
Agriculture, all right, whatever, farming, agriculture, okay. So let's say people, which is already happening, people are getting roosters, which they really shouldn't, but whatever, my father told me that years ago. Anyone getting a rooster doesn't know what they're doing. They don't like their neighbors. So what if all of a sudden, John, there's a lot of problems with noise from something that we approved in every zoning district? You're telling me that we can't do anything about it. I think we probably could come up with some zoning change in certain districts or something to curb some of that. So, you know,
Absolutely.
when we started, you know, there was only 4 zoning districts on Nantucket in 1972. Everybody had their own shop. Everybody had commercial and residential use on their property when they had a business. It was, you know, everywhere. I think that it's hard to make the case that if we make this use legal everywhere, well, it's happening everywhere. It's in every zoning district now. It happens in town, it happens in Wauwinet, it happens in every district, probably including MMD. So reining it back in is going to be a process that's going to begin, you know, in a sort of, I think, a constructive way once it's legalized. I think that there's a way to explain that a lot better than me, John, but I think that that's, you know, the basic premise of this. I mean, how would we say one zoning district can't have short-term rentals? Like commercial versus residential, for example. I mean, that would be impossible because it's in every single district.
Right.
If there was 2,300 commercial shops on Nantucket already in existence in every district, you'd have a hell of a time figuring out how to unwind that. So that's what I'm trying to make a comparison to something else that we have slowly fixed over time through zoning and change in zoning districts and everything else. But this is a different type of use. This is more of a home occupancy than a true, what we consider commercial use, meaning construction, that type of business, retail, you know, that's, I think that's where we're going here.
Yes, John.
Mr. Chairman, I would just comment on that. The rooster example, you know, your Board of Health has the ability to investigate sources of filth and nuisance. And typically that's the way we would approach a crazy rooster keeping people up in a neighborhood. You wouldn't do that necessarily through zoning. You know, the Board of Health, and again, these regulations that the board will be adopting are going to specifically address those kinds of nuisance conditions. So regardless of whether it's allowed as of right under zoning, it is still going to be subject to enhanced regulation by the Board of Health. And that's where you'll get your compliance.
Thank you.
Andrew, please.
Mr. Chairman, I just wanted to point out that, you know, short-term rentals before, you know, have been, as we all know, have been in place here for decades, you know, if not at least a century. And there is no restriction on how many hours or days or whatever. That's the current situation. This whole short-term rental concept sort of, you know, developed first through the ability to collect the tax and then through the legislation that passed only recently. So again, I think, you know, we're moving this into codify what really has always been happening. As far as future, you know, you have future town meetings and future warrant articles that you consider at a later time. And also, you know, grandfathering also ends if the uses are abandoned over time. So, and there's a specific period, I believe it's 2 or 3 years in our bylaw. So again, we don't have any of the data, you know, we have the data from the state, but again, the registration process is what sets the data and provides us the information, you know, which can lead to other regulations or potentially other zoning bylaws in the future. So, and I just do want to, you know, point out that we still have public hearings to discuss the merits of this, and the key question is, you know, does it go into the warrant, which is supposed, you know, set to be adopted soon. So, thank you.
Thank you. Campbell.
Sorry, I thought I unmuted. Yes, thank you. So two things. First, in listening to Fritz's concerns, I would have just sort of came to me, and of course, as we know, those things aren't always good, but so I wasn't quite sure whether there would be a way to have, to reduce what was termed grandfathering through the registration process, whereby annually or biannually you're re-registering perhaps to the current regulations and bylaws, et cetera, so that you might be able to avoid getting into a situation where you blanket allow everything and then you try and pull it back. That, in my experience, is more difficult to do. But so I didn't know if there would be a way to try to address that through the re-registration process, number one. Number two, to Nat's point, if you are awoken or have a troublesome rooster at this time, it's a noise, it goes under the noise bylaw, and you get in touch with the police, complain about the noise, and the animal control officer will come to work with the person who owns the rooster to get them darker housing, that kind of thing. So just to clear that up briefly. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Campbell. Barry, unless John, do you want to respond to any of that, or?
I don't think so, not at this time.
Okay, thanks. Barry.
Thanks. Here we are again, and sometimes creating or changing bylaws can be a little testy at times, especially when you're not sure what you're dealing with in terms of the overall specificity of things. Translated, perfect should never be the enemy of the good here. We're going to try to make something good, if not slightly better. And I think going through the Board of Health makes sense, but more importantly, the data collection of these things that we're surmising will help tremendously. It won't be an abstract, there's, for everyone who puts up a tertiary dwelling, my God, it turns into something else. I'm so sorry. Anyways, the more data you collect and the more you're able to substantiate that certain things are or are not working, I think has a tremendous asset to it. Because if you do enact or change the regulation later and you can come up with specific reasons for why you're doing it as well as the data behind it, it forms a very solid case. If someone wants to sue you at this point, it's going to be up to them to have to contest those facts and that data to try to say, oh, okay, fine. They don't know what they're talking about. So I'm kind of more of a fact-driven person. And to me, that tends to be, I think this is the way to go to begin to get a handle on this and maybe make better sense out of it. So thank you.
Thank you, Barry. Andrew?
Sorry, I just had one more, and Barry reminded me of one other point here, is that remember that we are being litigated now, and we've had one suit, and the ZBA has decided another issue, in favor of the building commissioner's interpretation. But those lawsuits, that pit neighbor against neighbor and take a lot of our time, a lot of ZBA time, a lot of town council time, are just as problematic as speculating about lawsuits in the future. So, we have lawsuits and litigation on us now. And, by addressing this, we are addressing the underlying causes for some of that. So thanks.
Campbell, is your hand still up from the last time? Oh, there we go. Steve.
Yes, sorry.
That's all right. Stephen.
Hey, everybody. I just wanted to real brief comments. I understand and agree with the concept of codifying what was a common practice that's recently come into, speculation as to whether it's legal. but that legality is being questioned due to judicial acts. So it makes sense to me that we're documenting there is a right. As has been said for decades, if not centuries, I can imagine our founders had a barn that they rented space out. Maybe there was a ship's hand who stayed in there. So that would have been illegal. I also just wanted to comment. I think the Board of Health is the right place for this. You may or may not know my past history in community association management. By and large, the biggest single complaint over tens of thousands of rental weeks, literally over 10,000 rental weeks, is noise, and then it's parking. And parking goes away pretty quickly when noise is addressed because, everyone's happy. They're here on vacation, or if they're here as a summer resident or year round, it just kind of tends to blend into the background. Noise is really where it's at. And I think while noise may be in our bylaw under typically picked up by the police department, it is something that is documented to be a health concern and issue. And you may or may not believe that, but and I'm not suggesting that making some noise outside somebody's window in closely held quarters downtown or in other areas around the island where rentals occur is a health concern, but generally noise pollution is. And in a sustained basis, it can create a lot of health issues. So anyways, I think the health department's the right place for this and through the Board of Health when it kind of overflows into overcrowding. So I just wanted to support that concept. Thank you.
Thank you. Fritz?
Yeah, just a couple of more, and this touches on specifics of language that we haven't talked about, but I guess I'll open it up for discussion. And some of it I'm not sure I completely understand, but let's focus for a moment on the two provisions or the limitation on apartments and workforce housing. And so I need an explanation of exactly how short-term rental, do we have short-term rentals and workforce housing right now? And really, so just a general explanation of, I'm not sure I understand the issue when it comes to apartments and workforce housing. But specifically then, in the outline, it says prohibit short-term rentals and apartments and workforce housing zoning bylaw. Well, it doesn't prohibit it. It says the planning board by special permit can prohibit it. So I'm not a great fan of special permits, as you know. My response, I guess, would be we ought to either decide whether they're permitted or not permitted and write the zoning bylaw in that way. So that's my comment.
Cameron, do you want me to respond?
Yes, please.
So right now in workforce housing, in the workforce housing rental, there's basically two that the board has approved, and they have put restrictions against them in both of those. And that is basically Richmond and six fairgrounds. There was an earlier apartment building proposal where the board also put a restriction. And I believe that we discovered there was a short-term rental occurring in there and basically had that removed through, zoning enforcement. As far as the workforce ownership, we did not put a condition that units in the workforce ownership development could have or were not allowed to have short-term rental. And it was something that I believe the applicant asked to retain there. So if the board wants to prohibit it, that's fine. That's certainly a possibility. We included it that you could restrict it so there wouldn't be any potential challenge to that. Or a developer saying the board's exceeding its authority by prohibiting that type of unit. So We think there's a case that, if a project is moving forward and there's creation of affordable housing, that there might be a case to leave it. But you all can decide what you want to do.
If I may, real quick, Fritz, I mean, I understand the definitive yes or no that you like to see, Fritz, but I think by special permit gives us the flexibility, because I think in some apartment buildings, it's appropriate and in some it's not. So I like the flexibility. I like the special permit because it's a way we can say no. So that's my personal opinion. But thanks. Were you done, Andrew?
Yeah.
Fritz? Did you have-
Yeah, just one, I think I'm coming to the end. Just a question to town council. Does the select board, does the planning board have the power today, without any other legislation or zoning bylaw, to impose a restriction as a condition of any special permit or subdivision to prohibit short-term rentals?
If we do.
Mr. Chair, through you. So I think you heard Andrew say that there have been instances where that has occurred. But when you don't have that authority specifically set forth in your bylaw, there's always the potential that somebody could challenge a denial or a condition in a special permit prohibiting short-term rentals as being something that exceeds the authority of the planning board. There's been many, many times where the planning board has been sued over special permit conditions, and that can get pretty costly and delay things. And my recommendation generally is put it in your bylaw if that's what you want to do. It adds, I think, great weight to the decision. There's a whole body of law established with respect to special permit conditions. And I think you're far better off having that in your bylaw than not.
Thank you.
Are you done, Fritz? Okay, Andrew?
Mr. Chairman, just not to belabor this, but to add to that, I did provide all of you board members, with a recent case from Concord, where a number of conditions that all related to affordability and other things were stripped out by the court as exceeding the authority of the planning board. So hopefully you all read that, but I think it's a prime example of what was just discussed. Thank you.
Andrew, through the chair, can I ask you a question, Andrew, that's popped into my head a little bit when Fritz brought that up about the subdivision thing? So like, for example, Knot Shop, there's no second dwellings allowed forever. No pools forever. Pine Valley, had a restriction that ran out in 30 years under that existing RC2. But Knot Shop, it was still RC2 way after the 30 years, and nothing changed. Certain restrictions last. Andrew, I know you've explained this over the years. I don't know the exact language. But certain restrictions that we can put on developments, especially back in the day when there were big ones, now there's not really that many. I think that what you just said with that case sort of separates the typical limits that a subdivision approval can have versus a use that is a little different than, say, someone not being allowed to build a second dwelling or a pool or certain things for the subdivision of that, something like that. Is that sort of correct way to, I'm trying to make a comparison to something that we have on Nantucket now.
Right, and I think, through you, Mr. Chair, the issue becomes, a rational nexus between what the board is imposing as a condition. Certainly, the planning board has existing authority about the number of dwelling units on a property. That's why you review second dwellings in the first place. When Noshop was approved in the 80s, where allegedly all kinds of great planning was being done.
No access road.
At 2 meetings, by the way, with over 240 lots, secondary access. Sorry, I digress here. That, conditions that exceeded that basic, there's some basics that the board is allowed. And it also relates directly to waivers. So there's sort of the relation to waivers. And, I guess to a certain extent, your negotiations with the developer, what they voluntarily agree to, and then what they sort of refuse to do. And that's a fairly old subdivision. Again, RC2 and, minimal requirements. I think we've come a long way, certainly from that period.
But my point, Andrew, just one more thing, and then I'll leave this alone. Like, a pool can't be built in Noshop at any of those lots. And believe me, there's plenty of room for a pool. So my point is, restricting that versus how someone rents their house is like completely different type of situation for a planning board condition. I get, that's what I'm trying to say. And I think that that's important to understand. Like, it's not like just any old condition to say to someone, you can't rent your house for less than 31 days. You know what I mean? Versus not having a pool on any house in the entire development. So I think that that's important to make that sort of comparison. And there are other things that we could talk about, but I'm just saying that it's completely different type of situation. So.
Right.
Anybody else? Andrew, what are you looking from us as a board for here? Just discussion?
I guess what I'd be looking for is for you to make a recommendation to the select board to include this article, either as written or with any other changes that anyone is proposing for inclusion in the 2022 warrant.
All righty.
Before a motion comes forth, Andrew, is there anything, Andrew or Leslie, that you have heard tonight, especially with John here, to add to this or subtract from this or something to, any of this discussion create anything that would change anything in this now, in your mind? I know you guys take notes and think about things. I'm just asking. Or is it all pretty much covered the way it is?
I think it's covered, but if you have all other policy issues that you want to discuss, now is the time.
Do we have the right to, under a special permit, to restrict them in a subdivision in this?
We're adding this in to the workforce ownership special permit, because the workforce ownership is both a special permit and a subdivision. I don't believe that you have the right to add it into a standard subdivision through that process.
So, all right, you're talking about R5 and CN right now, right, Andrew? The ones that were under that workforce housing bylaw?
It's just R5, and then we have a proposal to expand to R10, which is the second article of.
Okay, but I mean, that's what you mean. That's what you're, when you say that, I'm not sure if everybody knows what you're talking about. So that's what you're talking about.
Yes.
The ones that were under that.
Right,
Okay.
the workforce ownership is both a special permit and some sort of a division of land. It's either a
Yeah.
subdivision or an approval not required, but you need both in order to proceed.
So Sachem's Path, what would,
That's a 40B. That's totally different. That's a
that was a friend, okay.
ZBA, totally different process. Yeah.
So, but if we had an affordable style subdivision that wasn't a 40B, would we be able to restrict it in that?
That's what he's saying.
Yes.
It's not a 40B.
Right now, you could, again, you could try to do that. In the case of when this came up before, you could say, well, we're only going to approve this with this condition. And if the developer or, the project proponent said, well, you're exceeding your authority to put this on here, your bylaw is totally silent on this, I'm going to sue you for that. That I think could be a real situation into the future. We
Yeah,
didn't,
that's a concern.
so that's why we're adding the language. I think you heard from John that it's a good practice to include that. So again,
Okay.
anyone who is using that bylaw or proposing that bylaw moving forward would know that that's a condition that the board could implement and that we have solid ground to say no.
Okay, as the bylaw stands now, that's in there.
The one that we're proposing, yes.
Okay. Fritz. Fritz. Oh, you're muted, I think.
I'm totally confused about what you just said. So I thought Dave asked the question, if we had a subdivision, could we impose a short-term rental restriction on the subdivision? And I'm not sure what you said.
Okay, well, I'm going by the agenda item, not a general discussion, but if the question is, in a regular subdivision, can we impose no short-term rental? The answer is no.
Okay, thank you.
So anybody else? Yes, Fritz.
I just have just a question as to what Andrew, when you asked, what is Andrew, ask Andrew what he was looking for, and he responded. Just to go to that issue. Are you suggesting that you would like a vote from us to include, to vote to include the bylaw in the warrant tonight before the public hearing?
Andrew, but yes, we have to get it in the warrant before we can have a public hearing on it. Is that right, John?
Yes, of course.
Andrew, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Of course, Mr. Chairman, the warrant is the first step. You don't have a public hearing before we have an actual warrant article. If
Okay.
there is no warrant article, then we wouldn't have a public hearing. It of course has to be included.
Okay.
Steve?
Thanks. And my understanding, just what I thought was obvious, is that this isn't a recommendation in favor or any discussion on that point. It's simply to put it on the warrant so that the public hearing can proceed.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Barry?
Thanks. So I'm not getting this. I'm getting the sense we're pretty close to the truth here. So that's going to be my motion at this point. Is
Can
that
I'm
yeah?
gonna
Do you want to talk
for a second? No, David had his hand up for a second there. I don't know if you want to make a motion. Or
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, no, I'll wait.
No. It was fleeting. Are you good, David?
I'm good. Yeah.
Okay, go
Because
ahead.
it's not a
Barry.
recommendation.
It's-
All right.
it's
So-
a recommendation to put it on the warrant, but that's that. Yes.
Right, and even now, and once we put it on the warrant, again, there's public testimony, public hearing, and golly knows we could change our mind in the end.
Well, we
But
can
David
give a
was-
recommendation.
Pardon?
we could give it a different recommendation. We're just saying we want to see it on the warrant, Yeah.
Absolutely. So that's my motion at this point is let's take it to its next phase and get it into the warrant.
Yeah.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All righty. I guess I got a voice vote from everyone. Barry,
Yes, affirmative.
Nat,
Aye.
Fritz,
No.
and I am an I. Is that everyone?
That's it.
It gets sent on.
John makes $50 a year on a rental, so he's got a queues.
All righty.
I just got off the phone with John and he's logging back on.
All right, great.
$50. Okay.
Welcome back, John. You were missed.
Thank you, guys. Thank you, Meg, for giving me a heads up. Is it okay to talk? Are you finished with your discussion? Great. Well, thank you very much, Dave. I appreciate you stepping in. I guess we'll move on to the next discussion for the tertiary dwelling. No, I'm sorry, Leslie, you're shaking your head. Is this just, maybe I have the wrong agenda.
It's the workforce housing article.
Is that on page 14? Zoning bylaw amendment, workforce home ownership housing?
That's the one.
Okay, sorry about that. I jumped to one before. All right, I guess I'll open it up unless Leslie or Andrew.
Mr. Chairman, I can just go over this.
Introduction on it.
Sure. So as you may remember, we had an early meeting with the Affordable Housing Trust, and they asked us to look at a couple of different articles. This one was to expand where the workforce home ownership housing special permit could be proposed. There is a density bonus that basically goes along with this, and it currently is restricted to the R5 zoning. At the time, we discussed possibly expanding it to the R10 and possibly R20 zoning districts. Based on our review of the R20, we don't recommend that move forward at this time. The R20 is really diverse in terms of some of it is within the town overlay district, some of it is outside in the country overlay district. Some has sewer, some does not. Some of it is far flung, like out in Squam. So we don't recommend including it at this time. And the board, part of the ongoing work of the 2009 master plan is to get those areas that are located outside of the town district. So R20 really belongs in the R20 belongs in the town overlay district, and those R20 areas that are located in the country area are supposed to be changed to basically the country zoning districts. So we don't think R20 works for this particular bylaw at this time. So R10 is something that we think is possible. And we did change they're recommending changing the density bonus to 1.2 instead of the 1.33. So in this case, you would have to have essentially 3 conforming 10,000 square foot lots in order to, you have to have a minimum of those. So you have to have 30,000 square feet of land under single control to create an additional lot in this R10 district. So the factor is rounded up above 0.5. So if you had 2 lots in R10 under the same control or an equivalent of 2 lots of 20,000 square feet, you would not have the same density bonus. Again, you would have to have a larger area. We thought about that and thought that, you know, there are existing areas that we didn't want to impact, you know, a lot of redivision of side-by-side lots, and felt that, you know, having a minimum of 3 or the equivalent of 30,000, which is essentially 3 times the minimum, was the right size for that particular zoning district. So Leslie, I don't know if you have anything else to add, but that's the proposal that we've come up with if you want to proceed with this article.
Leslie, you're muted, or no, that. Okay, so Andrew, the way I understand it, it really is just a mathematical calculation, best to use specific examples as you were describing the R10 with the 30,000 square feet or more. My question is, when you've looked at these zonings to add those in, do you have any indication of how many lots on the island this would affect in that particular zoning that you're trying to include? And how many would be substantial in a zoning district like an R10, 10,000 square feet zoning, where you would have 40,000 or 50,000 square feet available?
Right. We developed a list of properties. There's not a lot, as you know, there's not a lot of oversized properties. Leslie, do you have that list handy by any chance? No, we reviewed it.
Yeah, Megan has the list. I think it's in the packet, actually.
And I think just to remind the board, this is a special permit, so you would be able to put conditions about, you know, number of houses and on it. Some of these actually do not lend themselves, like the Pinecrest Drive properties, not lend themselves to this particular concept because of the current odd structure of the lots. They don't meet the frontage requirements.
Just by adding up, it looks like there's potentially 38 lots that this really would affect around the island with the zoning potential change. And then of those 38, you're saying that someone might not meet the criteria, like the Pinecrest. So you're going to be eliminating about 5 or 6 just in that alone. So I just didn't want to have a false impression of how many, island-wide properties were going to be, affected. It looks like there's some greater good that can come out of this, but it was not something that would affect the entire island. We're really looking at, 2 or 3 dozen properties at best.
And a lot of these, I think, come off. I mean, I believe that, Nancy Severin's trust property has a restriction on it, town of Nantucket. The ice company, the other town of Nantucket, are the school properties. So again, some of these come off as well.
Okay. I'll open it up to the board if you have any questions or comments to anyone. Andrew. And Meg, if you see a hand, I'm going back and forth, up and down. So just let me know if there's anybody that has a question on the board. I see Dave Iverson ready to speak. Go ahead, Dave. You're on mute.
I mean, I don't really have a question. I just kind of have an observation or just a thought that I know that there aren't a lot of properties this will be available to, but I just think that it's an important tool to have. And yeah, it may not be used ever. It may be used a couple times, But if it's another tool to help encourage some affordable housing or workforce housing, I think it's important that we act on it. Thank you.
Any other comments by the board? It doesn't look like this is generating as much discussion as the previous one. No, with that, Andrew, what would you like to see us do with this? It doesn't look like there's much.
Mr. Chairman, the same motion would be to ask the board to include this, recommend that this be included in the warrant, in the 2022 warrant. We will, of course, have a public hearing and have testimony.
Yep, I make that motion,
Is there a second?
include it in the warrant.
Excuse me, before Barry's your hand up to second?
Yeah, I'll second it. There you go. That's
Okay.
what needs to be done.
Great. Motion's been made by Nat and seconded by Barry, and let's do a roll call. Nat,
Aye.
Barry,
Aye.
Dave,
Aye.
Fritz. Fritz? You're muted, Fritz. Sorry, Fritz, you're still muted. I haven't heard anything yet. Maybe a hand gesture? Yes, a thumbs up or down? Hello?
He might be rebooting or something.
Well, he's
You'd have lost him.
Fritz. I can see you on the motion. Yay or nay? Fritz, you are booting, last chance, and I'll just have to pass over you. Yeah, is that your hand for yes?
I'm sorry,
There you go.
somehow I lost the screen, so I couldn't unmute and I couldn't see you and I couldn't speak.
Well,
So
we're glad you're back.
I've been just madly pushing buttons, trying to figure out how to get back.
Nothing worse.
I could hear
Nothing
you
worse.
talking. No, yes.
Okay, and the chair votes aye, unanimous 5. All right, thank you very much. Andrew, with that, is there anything else for further discussion?
No, sir.
All right, unless anyone else has anything to add, I would
Motion to
entertain-
adjourn the meeting.
To adjourn. Barry made the motion. Is there a second?
Second?
Dave Iverson, second. Roll call. Barry,
Aye.
Dave,
Aye.
Fritz,
Aye.
Nat,
Aye.
and the chair votes aye. Thank you very much.
Care, everybody.
Good evening. Have a good one.
Thanks,
Thanks.
John.
See you in a few minutes.
Yep. Thank you.